Hello everyone, and welcome to our November essay here on the financial diet. This month, I want to talk to you guys about something that I have been thinking about basically constantly this year, in large part because of my recent book that just came out on October 21st called Having People Over, which is all about hosting, gathering, getting together, making and keeping friends, and just kind of the lost art of community. But aside from my book and all of the content we've been doing about it, which you can check out in the links below, we are in the throes of the holiday season, which I think for a lot of us, I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, with each passing year can feel less about community and more about consumerism. Obviously, Thanksgiving, for example, is less of a gift-giving holiday, but between Black Friday and Cyber Monday, it's almost just about consumption as Christmas now is. And Christmas, which, to be fair, in our very loosey-goosey interpretation of it here, because like many Americans, I'm not particularly religious, so my interpretation of Christmas is very vibes-based, especially as we are perceiving it through social media, is just increasingly a way to spend money. It's a small thing, but for example, the fact that it's become totally normalized for people to have different themes for every single year of Christmas decorating, that to me is crazy. I don't understand why we wouldn't just have our ornaments and put them up every year, and maybe every year you add one ornament to your collection, so it's kind of Ship of Theseus style, where by the end of your life maybe you have different ornaments than you started with, but to have every year get a different Christmas theme is crazy. And that's just the decorating part, the gift giving aspect of it, the enormous amount of travel that is often required, which is in and of itself an enormous expense, all of the parties and the clothes you're expected to wear to the parties, which often again have to be different for every photo being taken, the people who randomly love getting married during Christmas and New Year's, which I'm always you can't squat a holiday. What are we doing? Also, as our friend behind the camera is pointing out, little treat disease becoming debilitating during the holidays. I'm never not at those Christmas markets getting an incredibly mediocre food or beverage for at least $25. Eat me! So anyway, all of this is to say, the replacement of community with consumerism is something that I have been thinking about a lot this year, and it's also something very relevant to our holiday season. But at the end of the day, the reason I even wrote that book in the first place is because on the whole, Americans are really fucking lonely. And the fact that all of our previous moments of community and connection are increasingly being sort of taken over by just endless forms of consumerism is not a coincidence. Because if the question I was answering with my book is how do we be less lonely? And for me, a lot of that just comes down to more gathering in the home, which is often easier, more accessible, and more budget friendly. Kind of the bigger question I'm interested in is why are we so lonely? And perhaps even more pointedly for this channel, who is getting rich off of it? Because everywhere we see loneliness in America, we are also seeing incredibly lucrative industries pop up around it. And although loneliness is also a crisis for older people in this country, especially seniors, and this is especially true for senior men, it's part of the reason why women on average have better health outcomes as they age, because they typically have friends. The loneliness epidemic and the industries that are capitalizing on it are kind of more uniquely a young person's phenomenon. Because while young people may be doing a lot of things better in terms of health, notably we're doing a lot less smoking, drinking, and laying out in tanning beds than previous generations, which is an undeniable win for longevity and skin laxity, we are distinctly falling behind when it comes to loneliness. Only 42% of US adults under 30 feel close to people in their community, compared with 60% of those in the 50 to 64 age group. And this is particularly jarring when you consider the negative health impacts of prolonged loneliness, which by some measures is as damaging to health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. So follow the Chelsea Fagan method and smoke 14 cigarettes a day, but have a lot of friends. It's also, I think, worth doing a really quick sidebar on the smoking, drinking thing as it comes to young people. I talk a lot in my book about reclaiming the concept of the cocktail hour for our generation without necessarily involving alcohol, because one part of the reason that young people are socializing a lot less and having a lot less community is because in cutting out drinking culture, which I think is in many ways a good thing, they've replaced it with nothing. And when you look at the role that alcohol has historically played in human life, you can see interesting trends. For example, the fact that moderate drinking used to be associated with positive health impacts. Now studies are showing that the positive impacts that we were describing to moderate drinking was actually more due to the fact that in most cases, people who are engaging in moderate drinking are doing so in social contexts. So the fact that we happen to be necking red wine while hanging out with our friends, it turns out was actually just auxiliary to the fact that we were getting in quality time with our loved ones, which is the actual thing that has health benefits.
Don't make me drink alone. Don't make me drink alone. Don't make me drink alone.
And it's also undeniable that the phenomenon for young people of cutting out, let's say, bar culture and replacing it with bed rotting is also partially due to the relationship that young people are having with being on their damn phones. Roughly 87% of Gen Z self-report having a, quote, unhealthy relationship with their phones, according to one survey. And it's undeniable that the transition of everything from dating to political organizing to communicating between friends moving almost exclusively to social media has had a serious impact on the amount of time we're actually building community/meaningful connections IRL. But before we get into this month's video essay, here is a quick word from our sponsor, Betterment. While we've officially entered holiday shopping season with basically endless reasons to spend money, it's very easy to get sidetracked from your long-term financial goals. But luckily, Betterment keeps investing simple so that you can enjoy the holiday season while still building your wealth in the background. When investing your money starts to feel like a second job, it's time for a little work-life balance. Betterment builds and manages your portfolio while you build and manage your weekend and holiday plans. They make it easy to invest for what matters, so you just get to enjoy what matters. And with automated tools that simplify the complex, your money gets optimized day after day, again and again. Because while your money doesn't need a work-life balance, you do. So make your money work harder with Betterment. Get started, be invested, sign up in minutes. Head to betterment.com/TFD or click the link in the description box to sign up. But there's also kind of a chicken or the egg scenario happening in that we've also seen a total decimation of third spaces in almost every area of the country. Quote, less than half of Americans report that people in their community can gather in restaurants or diners, 46%, coffee shops or cafes, 41%, gyms or fitness centers, 37%, and local markets or corner stores, 35%. And relatively few Americans report that they spend time with their neighbors in bookstores or other retail spaces, only 20%, with barbershops and hair salons being at 22%. Now, a lot of this is down to just the actual physical layout of many American communities. But it's also due to the fact that with our phones constantly being connected to, I guess we could say, some version of the world, there's no longer that need to go anywhere outside your home or even your own bedroom to get a hit of social connection.
So my name is Samantha Dalton. I am a licensed clinical social worker, and in the state of Massachusetts, where I am also licensed, I am considered a licensed independent. I think we are trapped in a loneliness epidemic as a symptom of an epidemic surrounding effort and accountability. People are struggling with loneliness because there are legitimate physical factors contributing to that, such as the influence of social media. I think we are still navigating the ramifications of lockdown and the pandemic. I think work from home culture, the manosphere. I think there's so many factors at play. We're losing third spaces. All of these factors are playing into physical dynamics that I think are then being met by the toxicity that has sprung from the self-help industry. And so I think we have these two worlds colliding that are causing people to feel isolated. But then when they are realizing that the world that we live in now is going to require a significant amount of effort to rebuild those connections and fight against that sense of loneliness, they become very overwhelmed because there is this self-help engine over here telling them, well, if something is asking you to push yourself, that's asking too much of you. If something is asking you to put yourself out there, that might be asking too much of you. And I think people are getting tripped up around, well, I need to take care of myself and I need to put myself first and my boundaries. And so they lean into this and they're like, well, why am I still feeling lonely?
And in the absence of the villages that once defined our lives, many for-profit industries have popped up to replace roles that used to be people we knew and loved. For example, take the explosion of private childcare costs, and we'll be getting into this very bleak world in a later chapter. In some instances, childcare literally costs more than college tuition. Quote, around 47% of parents spend up to $18,000 a year on their childcare expenses, according to a new cost of care report from care.com, while 20% of parents indicated that they spend more than $36,000 in a year. The point is, if you take our sort of holiday paradigm of replacing what used to be community with just more and more empty consumerism, you can see that this is extended to almost every aspect of our lives. And if I'm thinking about sort of my work here at the Financial Diet being sort of in harmony with the work I do elsewhere, like in my hosting content, I genuinely think the conclusion that I'm reaching as I get older and as I do more research on these topics is that truly community is the antidote to consumerism. There are ways in which this is very literal. For example, like we used to live more intergenerationally, and so we never had to outsource private childcare. But there are also ways in which this is more sort of theoretical / emotional. Like when you're lonely, you are likely to spend more because it's a very easy hit of dopamine, and it can also do things like assuage superficial insecurities or make you feel closer to an ideal that you want to reach. As I've famously said in previous TFD videos, like often we are just spending money in interest of the kind of person we want to be. And especially when so many of our purchases are visible on social media, it can also be about like showing people who we are. Rather than them actually getting to know us, we can just show what seems like a really aspirational lifestyle. But in this video, I want to take the question seriously. Who is getting rich off our loneliness? Because I think in many ways, our loneliness is being actively perpetuated and then profited from. But before we answer those questions, we need to take it back to chapter 1. Why aren't we getting together anymore? For most of the 20th century, a lot of our social glue came bundled with institutions: churches and synagogues, unions, civic clubs, fraternal organizations, neighborhood associations, etc. To be clear, these were not perfect places, but they created built-in rituals, weak tie networks, and places to show up without a cover charge. And as those memberships all steadily declined, especially religious attendance, people lost a ready-made schedule for being with others. Pew Research has found that the share of U.S. adults who say that they attend religious services regularly has fallen consistently for decades, which tracks with the broader slide in institutional participation. And I want to be very clear for those of you who are going to be watching this who come from serious religious trauma. My point here is not to say that religion institutions were inherently a good thing, but rather they just were a thing that created an invisible social network that supported an enormous amount of American life. But if we want to get into why it's not exactly a terrible thing that the religious institutions don't have that same chokehold, we should talk about the shadow side of how we used to get together. Because most of that social cohesion was explicitly intergroup and often very exclusionary by design. Religions gathering with their same religions, ethnicities with their same ethnicities, so on and so forth. And for example, Black Americans needed things like the Green Book to travel safely because many restaurants, hotels, and roadside businesses refused them service, and even neutral third places functioned inside of a Jim Crow reality. And it wasn't just Black Americans. Women, for example, were barred from major business clubs until court fights as late as 1987 forced the door open at the Rotary Club. And queer communities formed flourishing subcultures in secret, in large part because they were completely excluded from public life. And that's not even saying anything about the actual bad dogma and doctrine that was happening within the religious institutions themselves. Like, even if we're talking about some like fantastical, like super welcoming, all-inclusive, multicultural church, like often those churches still came with like pretty dark stuff once you were actually getting down to the nuts and bolts of it. So deconstructing this old order, which was, again, often based on specific groups gathering within themselves, did remove some real barriers and lifted the chokehold that a much more fundamentalist interpretation of religion had on much of American society, which, again, is a good thing. But doing so for both religious and non-religious organizations, again, both of which were often exclusionary, also removed much of the automatic gathering structures that many people relied on, not just for seeing people in day-to-day life, but also very, very real financial, material, and practical necessities. Community with which you like made food and raised children and threw parties and borrowed money and traded skills and basically every other aspect of day-to-day life. And when these institutions went away, just like a lot of Gen Z replaced going out to the bar with literally nothing, nothing has really come up to replace them, at least not nearly at the scale it used to have.
Starting in the 90s and the 2000s, there was a significant shift away from organized religion as a whole. There was a movement, a very quiet movement that I think has become louder now with social media, and that is the deconstruction, the religious deconstruction movement. A lot of these institutions were problematic in their own ways. And I think that's the part that gets overlooked. Religious community had its problematic elements. Unions had problematic elements. Associations had problematic elements. I think community centers, which more often than not were dissolved because people didn't want to see them racially integrated. All of these organizations, as good as they were, they had their own downside. And I think people were starting to feel less like they belonged there and knew that that wasn't a space that worked for them anymore, and shifted away from that for better or for worse. But then exactly as you said, there was nothing created to catch anyone. And I think what went to play with that as well is the American sense of rugged individualism. Well, this group doesn't work for me anymore, so I'm going to go make it out on my own. And I'm fine on my own, and I'll be okay on my own, and it'll be great. And I think when communities were smaller, I think when people stayed in communities longer, I think that type of rugged individualism worked because in a way you were still around people that you knew for your whole life. And I think as people started to move for jobs and have different job opportunities and left or hated their hometowns and wanted to get out and finally had access to resources to leave, people started moving, and all of a sudden you have all of these little siloed individuals everywhere. Families were no longer staying together. Families were physically splitting up, whether because they wanted to or because they felt it was best for them. So there's just been, I would say probably if you look historically over the last 60 years, and I think with the growth of mental health, the expansion of understanding of mental health and what that looks like, and people starting to be more analytical of what their past was and what their values are, and that maybe I was raised with these values, but I don't know if these are the values I still want to have. All of this storm has kind of funneled together, which then leads into the advent of social media, which ended up profiting off of some of our worst insecurities.
So ironically, in the vacuum of many of these more not-for-profit religious or social or work-related institutions, we have essentially exclusively for-profit entities. Now, most of the default places to regularly see other humans will ask for a tab or a membership. Things like bars and nightclubs, despite the not insignificant decrease in young people drinking, do still remain a primary come-hang-out venue, and federal economic data does still show steady sector output for drinking spaces, i.e. our social time is getting constantly monetized. And the growth of fee-based third places like health clubs is also a big tell. Industry groups estimate over 70 million US gym memberships in recent years, which effectively turns casual community time into a monthly line item in your budget. Private members clubs have scaled too, with Soho House alone reporting hundreds of thousands of members and rising revenue in 2024, offering connection but behind a very expensive paywall. And by the way, as someone who's like literally never had any kind of social club membership or anything like that, I've been seeing like nonstop TikToks about how Soho House isn't cool anymore. So I'm gonna let you guys hash that one out amongst yourselves, but I posit the idea that like clubs of that nature were never cool. Was it ever? I went to like 2 Soho House events in my life back when it was cool, according to these same people who are now disgusted with it, I think, because they're just letting in anyone. These people yearn for the Titanic, I fear. Very like, will the lifeboats be seated according to class vibes. But anyway, like I went to some Soho House events back when it was cool, and it was like full of like the absolute worst men you would never ever want to be stuck in an elevator with.
Why men lie to hook up with women, part 1.
And free options, of course, do still exist in the form of things like libraries and parks, and we're always lifting those things up here at TFD, but funding and access are very uneven, and they can't always absorb the role that churches or civic halls once played. In short, if you want consistent, structured togetherness, you are often paying for the room. And I do want to say, because I think in any video that we create here at TFD, when we ask about what is the origin of a problem, the answer will often be from people that we are overworked and underpaid, and therefore people have no time for things like socializing. And I want to say that there are parts of this that are true, right? Like, it is definitely true that wages have stagnated. It is definitely also true that people are often having to work multiple jobs to make ends meet. But when you look at the role that community used to play in people's lives, like we can take it all the way back to places like, for example, pre-World War II, before the enormous amount of unprecedented American economic prosperity and therefore more time and disposable income to do fun things with, and see that community-based living and more free gathering structures still did play a much more important role in people's lives. And even something as simple as the ultra convenience presented to us by our phones, where essentially anything you need to do can be ordered or scheduled or organized or outsourced to a third party within a few minutes and clicks on the app, we just simply no longer functionally rely on community in the way that we used to. So who is getting rich from the disappearance of not-for-profit community at scale? Well, for example, venue owners, hospitality groups, fitness chains, and private club operators, things like Soho House or even Equinox, and anyone who can bundle ambiance with a recurring fee. This isn't inherently sinister, it's just where the profit lives when being around people becomes a product. Private clubs and premium gyms are the cleanest examples of subscription community, things like recurring dues, upsells, and a brand that sells belonging. And Soho House now breaks out a fast-growing membership. It sustains demand with a six-figure waitlist, roughly 111,000 people, as it scales to hundreds of thousands of members worldwide. Proof that charging for access to curated rooms, regular programming, and social status is a durable business model. On the fitness side, Equinox monetizes togetherness through monthly dues, roughly $200 to $400 a month, plus a digital tier of Equinox Plus at another $40 a month, and even ultra premium offerings like its longevity program, which is priced around $40,000 a year. I'm hearing reports that it's Equinox. I'm going to continue to say Equinox because I want to disrespect it. Now that we've started at the core of the problem, which is why are we not getting together anymore, I want to go out to sort of the first ring of loneliness as I think about it, which is that if we are not passively getting together anymore, if we no longer have these fabrics of community anywhere except maybe the workplace, which many people are increasingly doing entirely in isolation from their homes, we are not meeting people, which means that by extension, we are not meeting potential partners. Which brings me to chapter 2, dating apps and the price of being single. When it comes to dating at scale, meeting a partner moved from something that you did through friends or at work or local scenes, churches, community halls, etc., to platforms. By the late 2010s, meeting online had already become the dominant route for heterosexual couples, displacing introduction through friends, which used to be the number one. And newer cross-country data suggests that the US has crossed a symbolic threshold. By 2023, about half of new couples will have first met online, which tracks with what most daters I know are telling me. I co-wrote this script with our friend and frequent collaborator, Sabrina, who is currently going through it on the apps, and so she wrote a note to herself. Sorry, Sabrina. Although I will say, and I want to stand here as perhaps a beacon of positivity in this chapter, which is to say that I met my husband on OkCupid back in 2011, which was basically non-existent in France. He was like the only French guy on it. And for years we lied to his family and said that we met at a Starbucks because online dating was kind of looked down upon at that time in France. Shout out to all of his family that we lied to. I don't know why I picked Starbucks. I could have at least picked a more sort of romantic or aspirational lie. But yeah, we didn't want to have to go through the nightmare of telling his farmer grandmother who escaped Italy in World War II, being like, we met on this website. She wouldn't have liked that. I don't think she liked Starbucks. Rest in peace. Anyway, all of that is to say, even when I look back at the experience of dating on OkCupid back at the time when you had to log onto your desktop and the photo of the person was like this small and it was an entire page of their story, their preferences, it feels compared to the experience of being on a dating app now, like a completely analog thing. That was, even for being a dating site, much more about what the person thought or had to say or wanted to share about themselves versus many of the dating apps now, which are basically just a picture. But anyway, now the upside of everyone meeting online is real. There is an upside. It gives you a bigger pool of potential partners, more control for people who are shut out of older, more gate-kept dating venues, the ability to filter for values or identity. By the way, we all know what it means when a guy says he's moderate on a dating profile. But user experience is very mixed. Pew's most recent deep dive finds plenty of people meet partners online, while many, especially women, report unwanted behaviors and safety concerns. We're all on the apps, and we're all meeting more people than ever, and we all hate it.
It's an exhausting illusion of choice because you are getting access to so many people. You are seeing, wow, there are so many people in my area. There must be the ideal one for me. This is happening across genders, across sexual identity, right? We have this illusion of choice presented in front of us. And so if we start talking to someone and that conversation makes its way off of the app, maybe through actually texting, the second someone senses something they might not like or something they might be quote unquote concerned about, they'll drop it because they can immediately go back into this pool that presents them the illusion that, well, someone else is going to be there. Well, someone else has to be there. I'll keep scrolling and eventually I'll find that person because this thing over here just didn't work. And I think what we've lost because we're not having those initial conversations and those initial moments where we feel that we're open to a conversation, to talking, and that person is our immediate focus because we're at a bar or we're at a restaurant or we're at a friend's house. right? You don't have a choice. You have to sit there and kind of take this person in. Whereas on the apps, you don't have to do that. You can be having 10, 15, 20 conversations going at the same time if you feel so inclined. So when people start talking to somebody and it has made its way off the app and we start to feel that we're getting to know this person, there's this paranoia of, well, what if this person doesn't tick every box? What if this person does this thing that I find annoying? What if this person does this thing that maybe I didn't realize bugged me, but it does, right? Well, I don't know if I want to deal with that for the rest of my life. So maybe I could go find somebody that doesn't have that thing. But then because we're all human and flawed and we're not meant to be perfect, we're meant to be two imperfect people coming together, trying to like balance each other out and hold each other accountable and support each other through both of our imperfections, right? That's what a legitimate, healthy relationship is. We've now created this expectation that like, well, I need someone who's A, B, C, D, E, F, G. There's no other option. And I'm going to keep looking in this pool until I find that person that isn't annoying, doesn't bug me, has all of the traits, supports me perfectly. So we've created these standards that just don't exist for anybody. And as a single woman myself, I've had to hold myself accountable of like, whoa, like I have my own flaws that I'm bringing into dating and a partnership. So instead of focusing on like, well, what are the perfect things that I'm looking for? The conversation that can be more helpful is like, well, what are some of the things I'm willing to actually live with? What are the quirks? What are the personality types? What are the icks that maybe I could find it funny more than an actual ick? Could I allow this person to be a unique individual that I tell everybody I want? I want somebody who's different. I want somebody that's fun. I want somebody that's unique. Well, they're not going to be perfect. They're going to do things that are weird. Now, again, we're going to caveat this with, I am not talking about tolerating abuse or neglect or, anything in that realm. What I'm talking about is meeting somebody where they're at and accepting them for who they are.
Can I ask, are you on the apps?
I'm not. I used to be. But
Why'd you stop?
I didn't like going on dates.
Yeah.
I hate walking into a situation and being like, what can I like about you? It's not a good feeling. And it was just kind of boring and made me anxious for no reason.
How are you meeting people now?
I'm not.
You're not? Okay. Time to go to church, I say. What are they in Indiana? Lutherans?
A lot of Catholics. A lot of German Catholics.
German Catholics. That's a tough crowd.
They have a lot of kids. They have farms. They have a ton of beer. I just really like beer. Yeah.
Any German Catholics who want to weigh in, let's get some discourse going in the comments. Anyway, and part of the reason we all hate it is because there is no magic to these algorithms. And in fact, many of the algorithms are optimized not to match you with your ideal partner, but to keep you paying for the app longer and all of the in-app upgrades required to see better matches. The most standard algorithm is to some extent just a giant ranking. Each app leans on the data you give it to shape your dating pool. Think how recently someone was active, how close they are to you, whether your stated preferences line up, and whether people like you tend to like people like them. The paid features I mentioned, like boosts, roses, and super likes, also push some profiles higher for a while. Tinder, for example, says they moved away from a single hotness score and now rely on these fresher, more behavior-based signals to order their deck. But really, who knows? They could be making that up. And all of the other metrics are obviously affected by how hot you are. Hinge is unusually open that most compatible is a matching algorithm designed to pair you with someone you are statistically likely to like back physically. Its We Met prompt collects quick post-date feedback to tune future pics. But even then, the feed isn't looking for the one, it's looking for maximizing the odds that you two interact at all and that you keep interacting. So unless you find the one, you feel progress and you keep coming back.
I got a whole afternoon planned with Australian Vogue. I'm not just gonna drop everything to go downtown to see some cute guy.
He's straight.
I'll get my purse.
And much like many of the super exploitative mobile phone games we've discussed, which basically trick children into stealing their parents' credit cards to buy in-app features and upgrades, most of these apps also rely on a freemium model that keeps you on a perpetual ladder of paying, and essentially turns the app into a pay-to-compete system, which ruins it for everyone because even if you never pay, your experience is shaped by those who do. Boosted profiles rise, and non-payers get fewer impressions. At the very top of the ladder sits Tinder Select at $499 a month, an explicit premium tier for visibility and access. So who is getting rich off of the fact that we no longer meet people in real life anymore? Well, the platform owners and their ads and fee stacks, first of all. You have the Match Group, which includes Tinder, Hinge, and other platforms, which told investors in Q2 2025 that revenue per payer rose even as the payer base fell. So basically, you just have more people rage quitting the app and then the people who stay paying more and more money to dominate it. The quarter ran roughly $850 million in direct revenue, with higher revenue per payer carrying the growth. Bumble also leans on both subscriptions and a la carte features, and despite recent softness in paying users, it still posted hundreds of millions in quarterly revenue by pumping more money out of the users it acquired. It's also worth noting that Bumble, with Bumble BFF, sort of pioneered the transition of the app-based dating model to the friend space. Because just like we are no longer meeting in person and therefore no longer meeting potential romantic partners, we're also no longer making friends easily. And as apps get noisier, a parallel market has grown for expensive fixes, things like dating coaches, courses, and old school matchmakers who charge from the mid-4 figures into the 5- and 6-figure range. It's the same pattern as third spaces. Connection becomes a service and access stratifies. And even when these services help people, because sometimes they do, to be fair, they also turn loneliness into an endless money pit. Two mental health states that famously feed on each other. And this is not even to mention all of the Etsy witches who are getting rich off of either hexing your exes or giving you a tarot reading to know what's going to happen with your situationship.
He's sorry. Oh, he's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry. He's sorry.
Basically, online meeting is now the default, not the exception, and the algorithms surface likely interactions, not soulmates. And the revenue engine increasingly depends on moving users up a paid visibility ladder. That doesn't make apps useless, it just explains why they can feel efficient and exhausting at the same time. As Sabrina writes, poor Sabrina. But the idea that we are no longer just passively meeting people doesn't just make apps or matchmakers or dating coaches rich. It also makes certain industries rich that provide you with love and connection without ever having to interact with a human being. And that brings me to chapter 3, the pet industrial complex. Mona, don't listen to this. Now, I am delivering this chapter as a certified dink with a dog, which is to say I'm married, dual income household, and we have no children and no plans to have children, but we do have this 9-pound Libra queen who just celebrated her 11th birthday. Hello, let's celebrate that. Can we get a happy birthday, Mona, going in the chat, please? Mona? Mona? Just the tail starts going. Don't make me say a really nice word. People in the chat are wishing you a happy birthday. Is that exciting? Oh no, I've disturbed her. Oh, I know what's going on. So she usually has a blanket that's laid over this corner that makes it easy for her to lay on. This is her favorite spot because she gets to do like a panopticon in the living room. But we just got our upholstery clean and we're cleaning all of the pillowcases and the blankets and stuff. So I've really messed up her little apartment. Now I feel bad. Anyway, back to the chapter. Suffice to say, the amount of love that is going to animals in our lives in America and the role that they are increasingly playing in households, especially as we are having fewer connections with other people, is explosive. As social isolation has risen, and with it a wariness of putting ourselves out there for basically any human interaction, an enormous social premium has been placed on having and caring for animals. We can most clearly see the link between reduced human interaction and increased emotional reliance on pets in the pandemic, which is a time when pet ownership absolutely exploded. And now, quote, an estimated 71% of US households, or about 94 million families, own a pet, according to the 2024-2025 National Pet Owners Survey conducted by the American Pet Products Association. This is up from 56% of US households in 1988, the first year the survey was conducted. And although I was not one of those people who got a pet during the pandemic, did you?
No, I got one just after.
Just after. I was not one. I already had my pet, but I can say not having human connection and relying way too much emotionally on a small animal. When my husband had to unexpectedly leave the country for 2 years due to immigration issues the day before the borders closed, let me tell you that this little emotional support beam was really the only thing that got me through that time. So I'm not here to look down on anyone for seeking emotional connection via a pet.
I was this close to getting a hamster. I bought all the stuff and then had to return it.
So this is kind of a complicated one for me because I do believe that the relationships we can have with our pets can be some of the most beautiful things that life has to offer and can play a really, really important role in people's lives, especially as they are having less and less human connection. But it is worth interrogating how this role that pets have taken on in our lives is kind of being exploited financially. For example, veterinary prices increased by 63% over a 7-year period, which was nearly twice the rate of inflation. As Martin Coleman of the Competition and Market Authorities told the BBC, quote, many people were paying twice what they needed for vet medications, adding that people were often not being given upfront information and were often not given the estimates of the likely price of treatment, costing hundreds or even thousands of pounds. And that obviously is a stat coming from the UK, but this is a massive issue in the developed world affecting America as well. Quote, many Americans are also feeling the pain in their wallets. Over a fifth of pet owners, 22%, have at least $2,000 in pet-related debt, according to a survey from MetLife Pet Insurance. Some have gone to drastic lengths, as 58% of pet owners admitted to, quote, skipping meals out to afford their pets' needs. And it's also worth noting that while pet insurance can sometimes offset these costs, it is often very limited in what it covers and ends up costing more than it ends up saving the owner. I should note that our friend here behind the camera has been on a veterinary spending journey, the likes of which we've never seen. Did you have to go into debt for it?
I didn't, but it cost over $15,000
$15,000
for 2 separate things, and now she has asthma, so we're going back to the vet in 2 weeks.
Oh my God, you cannot catch a break. Okay. There's also the issue of daily pet care, much of which was available to do for free during the pandemic when many of these animals were adopted, but now needs to be outsourced to third-party companies or apps in order to meet the animal's needs, even if there, in my opinion, are still some ethical issues, such as dogs who are not adapted for cramped city life being kept for 90% of the day in a small apartment while their owner goes to work, but that's a completely different issue. For example, dog walking services are costing an average of $30 for a half-hour walk, and this can easily be hundreds of dollars weekly for someone who's gone back to full-time office work. There are also things like private dog training, which can be in the 5 figures. There are even pet psychics if we're really getting down to brass tacks.
And who killed this rooster's best friend?
He's heartbroken. He says he's going to make damn sure they don't get him.
What's going on with our pet spending? The point is, pets have taken on an increasingly important role in our lives, and certain industries are very aware that that means people are willing to spend a lot of money on those animals, often in ways that are pretty intentionally deceptive at point of service. So the question is, who is getting rich from all of this? And interestingly, the answer seems to not be the people who are actually working with the animals, like the veterinarians, the vet office employees, dog walkers and trainers, etc. Rather, the biggest winners appear to be the backers of Big Vet and Big Animal, whether that's the apps who are automating things like dog walking, or the big corporate conglomerates of veterinary offices, which are in many cases backed by private equity, and you will see a lot of private equity in this video. Quote, according to data provided by PitchBook, private equity poured $51.6 billion into the veterinary sector from 2017 to 2023, and another $9.3 billion in the first 4 months of 2024, seemingly convinced that it had discovered a foolproof investment. Industry cheerleaders pointed to surveys showing that people would go into debt to keep their 4-legged friends healthy. The field was viewed as low risk, high reward, as a 2022 report issued by the Capstone Partners put it, singling out the issue for its higher than average rate of return on investment. And as this happened, veterinary prices began to rise, a lot. Americans spent an estimated $38 billion on healthcare and related services for companion animals in 2023, up from about $29 billion in 2019. And even as overall inflation got back under control, the cost of veterinary care did not. In March 2024, the Consumer Price Index for urban consumers was up 3.5% year over year, while the veterinary services category was up 9.6%. If you've ever wondered why keeping your pet healthy has gotten so out of control expensive, Big Vet might just be your answer. But let's say you are not like me, a dink with a dog who would honestly probably be willing to spend an obscene amount of money to improve her quality of life. Come exploit me, private equity, what can I tell you? Let's say you did what J.D. Vance wants us all to do and you had some kids. Which, by the way, if you've met and married a partner and then proceeded to have children with them, you're already doing pretty well statistically on the battlefield of American loneliness, so hats off. But that just takes us to the next layer of loneliness, which is chapter 4, who is watching our kids? So let's say you've made friends, you've had a nice social life, you've met someone, you've gotten married, and you have a kid. What we have now is a new problem, which is that no one is here to help you raise it, and you probably increasingly need someone to do that. Because if we've established one thing on this channel, it is that the era of the stay-at-home wife/mom is largely over. Roughly half of married households now have both parents working full-time, with many more mothers than that working at least a part-time job. And of course, as we've long discussed on this channel, this is against a backdrop of the mother still taking on the vast majority of domestic and child-rearing labor in the home. But in addition to the fact that life is getting so expensive so quickly, while wages are staying stagnant, therefore driving more and more mothers into the workplace, often shockingly soon after their children are born, we have the simultaneous issue of fewer and fewer family or community members who can take care of those kids. Interestingly, there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that the reason that humans are one of the few animals where women go through menopause is because we were designed to live intergenerationally, with older, no longer of childbearing age women helping to take care of the younger and newborn kids. And this was down to the physical structure of how we lived, with most people living intergenerationally, either under the same roof or in the same very small communities until very recently. And of course, there are many reasons why grandparents are no longer taking care of their kids at scale, distance being one of them. But there's also the issue that the wage squeeze that's happening to new parents is also squeezing seniors. The number of seniors who are actively working or looking for work through their retirement has roughly doubled since the 1980s. So what has come up to replace it, since these kids will need taking care of? For most American families, the answer to that question is paid childcare, and this can come in the form of nannies or babysitters, private schools and tutors, or for most, daycare center. Quote, the cost of childcare has increased 220% in the last 3 decades, according to Lisa Hamilton, president of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, which since 1990 has tracked this and other issues around child well-being in an annual Kids Count report. The organization's 2023 report, released in June, found that 13% of children under the age of 5 live in a household where caregivers have had to make job changes because of childcare issues. 5 years ago, that number was 9%. The report also found that more than half of working parents with infants or toddlers reported having been late to work or leaving early in the last 3 months due to childcare issues, and 23% reported being fired for it. And given how expensive and pretty universally necessary these jobs are, you'd at least assume the people doing them tend to be reasonably well compensated. In fact, no, they are some of the worst paid people in this country. Quote, childcare workers remain nearly at the bottom of all U.S. occupations when ranked by annual pay. Full-time teachers in center-based childcare are paid on average $14.01 per hour, less than half of the $32.80 that kindergarten teachers earn. Only about 1/3 of full-time early childhood teachers have health insurance through their workplace, which is far lower than the 52% of workers across all sectors. The early childhood education workforce is about 96.7% female. In addition to typical degree credentials, about half of all early childhood educators have attained an early childhood education specific credential, such as a state license or child development associate certificate, and more than 2/3 have either a post-secondary degree or an early childhood education credential. The proportion rises to 76% among teachers and instructors. So if childcare workers are getting paid next to nothing, often not even getting health insurance despite having all these qualifications, and Americans are increasingly paying so much money for it, with a reported roughly 2/3 of parents, including 95% of low-income parents, spending way over the recommended 7% of family income, and roughly 98% of counties reporting their childcare as unaffordable, who is actually getting rich from the fact that no one can take care of our kids anymore? So it will probably not shock you to hear that the only people really getting rich are the people who actually own the childcare providers. So these are either the people or corporations who actually own the facilities, companies that license materials used by the centers, sometimes the business managers of the facilities themselves, although less so. But it will certainly shock you even less to hear that the big winner in this story is once again, drumroll please, private equity. As with so many private equity slays, they saw an industry that was already rapidly diminishing the American quality of life while also massively exploiting its workforce, and they thought they can get those numbers up. Quote, one of the primary ways that private equity is able to squeeze profit out of childcare, which has been a historically unprofitable institution, is by maximizing its enrollment. The more kids you enroll, the more tuition money comes in. And if you have just enough low-paid teachers to ensure that you're in compliance with state-mandated ratios, you can keep your labor costs down. Private equity-owned daycare centers also try to lower operational costs by, for example, shifting daily cleaning responsibilities from outside companies to teachers, and reducing the number of sheets of paper per day that they give to kids. kids. With this model, private equity-owned daycares are able to turn profits of 15 to 20%.
Right off the bat, when we're talking about the option of grandparents helping out with grandkids, people that I have worked with professionally, I completely understand when people make the decision that that is not a dynamic they want to have. Whether that's because they don't want to be putting that pressure on their parents, or whether that's because they don't have a good relationship with their parents, all of that is legitimate. And I think on the other spectrum, I think there are some people who take advantage of their parents for childcare. I think there's a lot of people who don't explore multiple options and just assume that it will be some type of a grandparent stepping in to help. It's complicated because this is so unique and specific to everybody's individual lives and situations and what they need. But I think to kind of tie all of that into the idea of a village is not just, well, I have like 3 people that I'm friends with and that I know I can hang out with and invite to things and talk to if I'm sad. A village is a layered experience. A village is, I have family or a chosen family that I feel I can rely on. I have friends that I can reach out to. I have neighbors that I'm familiar with. I have coworkers that I know and am familiar with, right? It's about looking at your geographical area and saying, how do I build different layers of relationships in this area around me so that I have different layers of people to go through when I do need help. And I had a client who in her neighborhood, because all of them, they did okay, but they didn't have private daycare money. They got together and they built their own daycare as a neighborhood. They came together and they would switch off days. Some people had flexibility and some stay-at-home moms were able to be like, nope, like I could take 2 days. Like that's okay with me. And they hashed that out that way. That is a village. A village is about having multiple layers of people that you can be creative with problem solving with.
It's also worth noting as we talk about education generally that that was also one of the places that used to be more of a not profit-centric gathering center for our communities. For many American families, depending on where the zip code goes, like they're not even considering sending their children to public school anymore, and it becomes a fight to get them into whatever for-profit institution they can afford. But that's for another video essay. But as I mentioned, the reason that these childcare centers have become such explosive areas of growth is because parents have been forced back into the workplace. Which brings us to Chapter 5, the death of the union and the rise of the gig economy. So work used to be one of our most reliable social hubs. You saw the same people, you often joined a union, you learned the ropes from someone who'd been there longer through things like apprenticeships and professional organizations. And that structure made belonging the default rather than a side quest. But union density has fallen to roughly just 10% of workers, down from about 20% in the early 1980s, which means fewer workplaces with formal structures for collective voice, mentoring, and shared norms. As work gets more fissured, gets outsourced, subcontracted, 1099'd, or mediated by apps, people are paid for tasks without the social glue of a team. The US Surgeon General has flagged social connection at work as a public health priority. When workplaces atomize, loneliness rises and health outcomes suffer. Now, this doesn't mean that all remote or independent work is bad. It means that the design of work matters for connection. Gig and platform models, for example, tend to push the risk onto workers and relationships onto screens, while the value climbs only for the platform. Think of, for example, ride, hail, delivery, or online freelancing apps. Uber booked $44 billion of 2024 revenue and then greenlit a new $20 billion share repurchase program in 2025. Classic, the toll booth business is thriving energy. DoorDash likewise approved up to $5 billion in buybacks, while Instacart expanded its program to $1 billion and has been actively repurchasing its own shares. Meanwhile, marketplace platforms like Upwork or Fiverr are posting record quarterly revenues, and all of this signals that it is the intermediaries, the Ubers, DoorDashes, Instacarts, Upworks, and Fivers of the world, who are monetizing the transactions and the user data and attention, while the people who actually do the work are shouldering their own tools, vehicles, fuel, taxes, and downtime with fewer protections or benefits than regular employment. And this risk shift, by the way, is not just a vibe, it is very well documented. Oh, we're on the move. We're on the move. She got her little crossed legs. What an elegant little lady.
I want you to step, bump, step, bump, bump, step, bump, step, bump, bump.
But no longer even having coworkers, let alone no longer having a union, means a huge decline in pay and protection. Union members, for example, still earn more on average than non-union workers, and unions bargain for things like scheduling, transportation, benefits, all things that also help foster stability and community building. It's also worth noting that outside of the workplace itself, many of these professional and trade-based institutions used to also be meeting places. I know we all think it's like extremely cringe when a woman gets on TikTok and makes her whole brand about being like, I don't know, a truck driver's wife or an electrician's wife or a doctor's wife or whatever the case may be. Military wife is a popular one. One's about like laying cables, whatever the case may be. But here's the thing. I do think there's like a bit of classism happening in the mocking of women who take pride in their husband's blue collar job. Don't love that. But more importantly, I think we kind of underestimate how much this strong group identification around a trade or a profession used to be like part of the fabric of American society. Like, these people took care of each other. And yes, the spouses did often also form community amongst themselves. Yes, those communities are often exploited by things like MLMs in places like military bases where often the spouses can't get gainful employment. But what the MLM is preying on fundamentally is the proximity and closeness and community-oriented nature that these professions are providing. It used to be an expectation that having your family be part of a certain professional organization or trade or community would have certain benefits. And I feel like we're a little bit playing ourselves if we don't acknowledge the benefits of that. But another thing that this proximity to the people we worked with and the trades that we were involved in used to provide, and increasingly doesn't, is a sense of apprenticeship. We now kind of take it for granted that you need to have things like college degrees and internships that you often have to pay for the privilege of working at in order to get a job, and that you often need to prove that you're already overqualified for a job in order to get it. But it did used to be, and still is occasionally the case, that you are expected to learn on the job through apprenticeships. In the year 2024, for example, there were roughly 680,000 active apprentices nationwide and roughly 112,000 completers. That is growth in recent years, but it is still a very thin slice of the workforce, with latest reviews saying that these earn and learn models are effective but very unevenly available. And meanwhile, the private market for career connections has exploded. LinkedIn, for example, reports 1.2 billion members. Microsoft disclosed over $2 billion in premium subscription revenue, and prior filings pegged LinkedIn's fiscal year 2023 revenue at $15 billion, about $7 billion of that coming from hiring software alone. We once expected to learn things by doing them and to even be paid while we were learning. And we have essentially been trained out of that expectation and are now being trained out of the expectation that we should even have a basic level of community or even know the names of the people that we work with. We are intentionally being isolated by employers, corporations, and often third-party apps because it makes it so much easier to exploit the individual and to transfer more risk to them. And even the act of training itself is often being outsourced, because when larger employers outsourced and slimmed down, they externalized their training as one of the first things to go. Earlier federal analyses documented a long-run decline in employer-provided training for many workers. And into that vacuum came a market for access, things like conferences, masterminds, private Slack communities, pro tiers, and one-on-one coaching. And much of it is useful, but it is now mostly behind a paywall. And the US trade show and conference industry alone is a multi-tens of billions dollar market industry annually, which tells you just how much professional connection has been monetized. Digital networking has also gone with the same route, where increasingly people are often expected to pay out of their own pockets for professional training, which used to be offered by the companies who are hiring them. So who's getting rich here? Well, in this case, a lot of people. So if you think about worker exploitation and increasing isolation as a sort of pyramid, at the very top of people who are doing the most exploiting, the most isolating, and the most personal enrichment off of the impoverishment of its workers, it has to be those third-party apps. Any intermediaries who are capturing fees, data, and network, things like ride haul, food delivery apps, the giant dating and professional app ecosystems, even things like Bumble double-dipping on romance and networking thanks to Bumble BFF, the platforms are increasingly setting the rules and the standards for how workers should be treated or even thought of. Meanwhile, corporations themselves have been able to massively increase profits, in part through workers having less and less leverage. It's not the only reason, to be sure, but one of the reasons for wage stagnation has been the fact that there's much less collective bargaining happening. By the way, if you want to talk about when America experienced most of its economic prosperity, we want to look at times like the 1950s, which is, by the way, when union membership was at its highest, nearly 40%. And in terms of getting rich, we also have things like event organizers or platforms that rent us the modern version of a hallway conversation or a professional apprenticeship. Everything from conference producers to professional networks selling premium reach. These services can be genuinely helpful, but the tension is that access to weak ties and membership increasingly depends on your budget rather than your actual skill or certification. And while I understand that there is a huge resistance to a push to back to office, especially from younger generations, and there is a lot of truth to that, we also can't forget how much keeping workers extremely isolated and disconnected from each other often also increases the ability to exploit them. And while it certainly shouldn't be our only source of connection or social activity, we need to remember that work can still provide antidotes to loneliness, but only if its structures support connection and collective empowerment, our voices through unions, our development through apprenticeships, and our time together, not just on tasks. Right now, the social fabric of work is extremely fragmented, while the ability to meet people, learn skills, and be seen is increasingly something that you must purchase a la carte. The fix is not to pine for the old office, it is to rebuild connections on purpose.
There is an incredible amount of resentment toward work in general right now. I think a lot of people are resentful towards their places of work, their jobs, their careers, rightfully so, in a lot of situations as you talk to people and hear what they're going through. And I think that overall negativity has created a cloud where, because of those negative feelings we have, there's no way work could be a place where we could know people, where we could build friendships, where we could build connections. Because if you go into a situation feeling like you're completely walled off, you can't selectively numb, you can't selectively wall off. So if you go into work and you don't like work, it makes it really hard to feel open enough there to put yourself out there and get to know people and be in a good mood and connect and talk about things outside of work, because it feels like the cloud is, I hate work. And so I kind of think we're butting up against this secondary symptom of struggling with identifying work as a place that could even be a place of connection.
But if we're going to talk about how lonely we are and who's getting rich off of it, we are going to have to end with our final chapter, social media and the breadcrumbing of community. And I don't say breadcrumbing community lightly, because much like in an otherwise completely withholding relationship, you might get occasional snippets of what feels like real love and connection, we are getting just enough from these platforms by design to not only keep us on them, but keep us feeling like we don't need the real thing. If we're going to discuss the dissolution of our collective village, especially as it pertains to our physical spaces, there has been one very clear winner who is enriching itself on our newfound low-grade agoraphobia: social media. In some ways, social media's role in our lives has come to replace nearly everything we used to rely on actual human contact to provide. Updates from our friends, political engagement, or at least the illusion of it, social invitations, etc., are all filtered through news feeds, which are designed to keep us scrolling, but not connecting. And speaking of, it has also finally become the way that the majority of people now consume their news, surpassing even television, which had previously been fairly resistant to the overtaking of social media. So much for news literacy, you were fun while we had you. Quote, social media has displaced television as the top way that Americans are getting news. The proportion accessing news via social media and video networks in the US is sharply rising, overtaking both TV news and news websites or apps for the first time. So before everyone comes in here and says, like, a lot of television news is bad too, I'm aware of that, but we're also talking about things like newspapers, news websites, like basically any other way you can get your news every day, people have replaced with scrolling their social media feeds, which, as we saw with the rapid decline of X, formerly known as Twitter, can easily be changed basically in a day algorithmically to only really feed you one kind of news. I never have more of a visceral experience of that damn bitch you live like this meme than when I occasionally log on to the Twitter account that I stopped using in 2023 to look at something, usually like something happening on reality TV that I want real-time reactions for, and like it is essentially unusable now because it's all just like endless right-wing news, and the replies of essentially any viral tweet are just AI bots, OnlyFans accounts, and racial slurs. Yeah, so Also, only getting your news through social media, let's just say compromised at best. But what makes social media, in my view, so insidious in this big question of why are we so lonely and who's getting rich from it, is that it is the clearest industry where their entire business model is predicated on giving us a false sense of being closer to each other.
Giving us the illusion of like, look at all these people who are also going through what you're going through. Look at these people who have had the same experience as you. You can connect with these people. Let's create these groups. And I think that helped. And it's lovely to know that if you're living in California, there's somebody in Florida going through the same thing as you. But you can't have that in-person connection, right? So it's somebody that you text with, maybe you talk on the phone with, maybe you FaceTime with, but there's still this missing element of feeling that you have people in your immediate circle that you can rely on. So it created the illusion that we're all connected, but we were still feeling this, I don't have a tangible person close to me that I can invite over, that I can go to their house, that I can have plans with, that I can do holidays with. So I think people were like, but I'm connected over here. Why am I feeling so disconnected over here? And then also the advent of the algorithm and funneling us, hyper specific, hyper focused content on what the algorithm feels that we want to see, that what we believe in, what we want to be exposed to. And so it's all of these systems at play have just caused us to now be in this moment where I think it was kind of everything was happening slowly and then all at once.
As I said earlier in the video, there is a real sort of chicken or egg phenomenon happening as it pertains to being addicted to our phones and essentially addicted to just a few specific apps and barely ever interacting with the people we actually know and love. Are we constantly scrolling more because we have lost all of that community and have basically no passive, not-for-profit third spaces anymore to find them? Or are we no longer interested in advocating for basically all of the social fabric that has been taken away from us because we are addicted to our phones, and it gives us a sort of quasi feeling of satisfaction of meeting those needs? Also unclear. Probably both. But what is very clear, and I don't refer to social media as being our kind of community methadone lightly, is that it gives us sort of just enough of the feeling of the community interactions that our brains, bodies, minds, hearts, clear hearts can't lose, used to rely on in order to keep us addicted and give us less of a reason to leave. For example, liking a friend's post about an accomplishment feels like a satisfactory substitute for actually reaching out and congratulating them. Even seeing updates from their life makes it feel like we have connected with them in any way, when often we can see it without having actually spoken to them in years. Commenting or resharing a news story about politics gives a similar feeling in our brains to having actually done something productive to help the political cause or situation. And even things like participating in often fear-mongering social apps like the neighborhood one give us all the suspicion of tight-knit community living without actually, in many cases, even knowing our neighbors' names. This, by the way, is only getting markedly worse with the rise of AI replacing actual people on the internet. Aside from the fact that on many social platforms, it is very hard to distinguish now how many of the commenters in a given comment section are even real people.
Hello, I'm here.
There's also the, in my opinion, deeply, deeply scary phenomenon of people falling in love with their chatbots. Even people who have actual spouses, like not you having an affair with ChatGPT. Like I've seen several news stories about this recently, and like I'm rarely a nihilist about this sort of thing. I rarely have that feeling of like we are so cooked, but like when you have like wives being interviewed about how they feel about their husband having a full-blown affair with their computer, it's a wrap. Time to start over. Let's get back to like sticks and rocks. But I don't want to get too into AI in this video because that is for another video. But even if we keep social media to the actual human beings who are on it and the way that we interact with them there, the reality is the business model of social media to falsely replace community in ways that keep us hooked on the apps is ultimately in service of how these apps can monetize us. Because it turns out that loneliness leads us to be on the apps way more, which means there's way more of us to monetize. They can serve us more ads, they can collect more of our data, and they can just dominate more of our waking hours. It's also important to understand, as we talked about in the very beginning, that this hyper-consumerism that has risen up in the absence of community is mostly being fueled by social media. I gave the example in the holiday season of people doing entirely new Christmas themes every single year to decorate their homes, something that largely did not exist before social media. But it's also worth noting that this sort of false connection of community, of seeing a person you don't know in the home you've never been in, do something that you otherwise would have never done, and leading you to to purchase something you otherwise never would have purchased is a closed loop that's only existed for a few years but now drives the majority of shopping. Quote, in many cases, the entire customer journey, from awareness to conversion, happens in one single app. Nearly 1 in 3 consumers now use social media to both discover and buy their products, and another third of consumers anticipating making more purchases on social networks in 2025, a number that rises to nearly half among Gen Z. Keeping our attention, selling our data, and influencing our purchases at the end of the funnel are the actual profit motives of social media, and with an increasing influx of content entirely generated and supported by AI, even the very minimal amount of human-to-human connection these apps were once providing, the arguable deal that we were making for giving away so much of our value and identity, is rapidly diminishing. For a lot of us, social media has kind of replaced many aspects of what used to be a community. Influencers replacing friends, comment sections replacing actual conversations, and just passively watching or at most resharing something instead of doing something. And these platforms have also fundamentally changed how we view ourselves, because so much about them is about the presentation of the self, the things we can photograph and document, whether it's the trip we took or the clothes we're wearing or how we decorate our homes for Christmas. For those of us who celebrate Christmas. Which is funny because at the end of the day, those aren't things that are meant to be shown. They're meant to be experienced. In theory, people should be experiencing you in 3 dimensions with all their senses, and that's also how we should be experiencing the world around us. Even something as simple as hearing how our friend's vacation actually was directly from them has vastly more psychological benefits to us than just passively watching it on our screen. It's also worth noting that many of the things that might look very aspirational on social media are often very complicated in real life. We don't have time to get into it today, but the number of people who are fueling what looks very impressive online with an enormous amount of credit card debt, for example. But the point is, the creators of these apps aren't stupid. They've not only figured out how to very effectively monetize the increasingly unhealthy amount of time we're spending on these apps, they know that the best way to get us hooked on them is to give us just enough of that community feeling, along with, frankly, any heightened emotion, many of which are negative, like getting angry at things we don't like to see, or disagreeing with someone, or being annoyed or envious at what someone posts. And perhaps what's most psychologically difficult to deal with is that we just fundamentally weren't meant to see this many people. The human brain was designed at a very fundamental level to have closer relationships with a much smaller number of people. If you think about it, even just a few short decades ago, you wouldn't really know any information about anyone that you didn't have a direct connection to, friends, family, coworkers, etc. And even then, outside of a few very close connections, you knew very little. You might, for example, work next to someone for 10, 15, 20 years and never see what the inside of their home looks like. Now you can take 50 people you've never met or haven't seen since high school in a single day and feel inadequate at a picture of their living room. I believe very fundamentally that community is the antidote to many, many of our social ills. Not only is it very literally important for our health, but it also provides us with many of the feelings that empty consumerism is set to replace, like satisfaction or self-worth. The more people know us and truly know us, the less we feel the need to perform for them. And one person's true acceptance and presence is worth 1,000 empty validations.
You owe other people kindness, respect, and intentionality and authenticity. It is not putting us out to say that we owe people the best of ourselves when we are able to give it. And I think we are able to give it a lot more than we give ourselves credit for.
But the reality is, keeping us separate is very profitable. Profitable for the companies that exploit our loneliness, that make every connection we can form a pay-for-play scenario, that are charging us intentionally inflated numbers for something as simple as keeping our pets healthy, because they know we'll pay for it. Because for many people, that may be the only loved one they regularly see. We're pushed to have children and then unable to care for them, and then have no one around us who can help. And in almost every single one of these scenarios, a corporate interest, or in many cases a private equity roll-up, steps in to say, you know what? I'll give you a way worse solution for that at a way higher price. I don't think all of these problems can be solved overnight, but I do think that we have more than average power to solve them ourselves. A lot of times you will see me end my video essays by encouraging you all to get more politically involved, because a lot of these answers are structural. And I want to be clear that especially as it pertains to things like employment, a lot of them are structural here too. But there are certain problems we've talked about, especially the ones that come from our person-to-person interaction and connection, that we do actually have more power to reclaim. And the answer is taking more of an interest in each other, stepping outside ourselves, going to places, showing up, meeting people, forming connections, collectively acting. Although it can be very, very easy to slip into these vicious cycles of isolation where we forget even what positive human contact can feel like and feel like we don't need it, or that it's too much of an effort in our already busy lives to go out of our way to get, we have to remember that many of our most insidious industries depend on us staying apart. And while it's good on some levels that, for example, we're not drinking as much as we used to, the fact that the answer for many people is to replace it with total isolation and scrolling on our phones is probably a net loss for our collective mental health and our ability to organize. Political polarization, too, is one of the biggest things that benefits from the fact that we rarely actually speak to each other. I've said this many times before, but I think it's worth repeating. If you're someone who's constantly feeling overwhelmed with news by scrolling your social feeds, give yourself permission to only read news like once every couple of days, but replace that time with at least one tangible action, ideally one that puts you in proximity to other human beings that you live around. We are lonely, and that is not a personal failing. That is the system working as intended. And the longer we stay lonely and avoid each other, are more suspicious of each other than we are welcoming to each other, the more we replace the falling of many social structures with absolutely nothing except phones, the worse this problem is going to get. And the fewer and fewer people who are going to profit from it. Because as we discussed, even the people who are working in a lot of these pop-up solutions aren't actually getting paid. Go outside today. Meet a person, maybe make a friend. It'll certainly cost you less than the alternative. Bye.